Okay, so what if I told you that the map of North America we know today was far from a guaranteed outcome? I mean, it literally almost didn't happen. Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into a story born out of intense conflict, deep regional fears, and some seriously bitter rivalries. The union of British North America into a single country was essentially a massive puzzle, and for a long time, it looks like the pieces were never, ever going to fit together. I am so incredibly excited to guide you through this one. We are taking a fascinating journey back to the 1860s to look at the geographical obstacle course, because that's exactly what it was that became the path to Confederation. We'll see how totally different regions, dealing with totally different problems, had to somehow find a way to compromise. Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap for today's tour. First, we'll hit the pressures for a union and the Great Coalition. Then we'll move eastward to look at Atlantic colony resistance, before expanding all the way out to the west, and finally, we'll explore the alternatives to Confederation. Right, let's get started with sections 1 and 2, internal pressures and the Great Coalition. By the mid-1860s, these colonies were being seriously squeezed. On the outside, you had looming threats from the United States, and internally, the province of Canada was locked in a bitter, completely paralyzing political stalemate. You had the French Catholic majority in Canada East and the English Protestant majority in Canada West trying to rule two wildly different groups with just one single government, and it simply wasn't working. Enter Liberal Party leader George Brown and Conservative Party leader John A. Macdonald. These men were fierce political rivals who fought endlessly, particularly over French rights. Brown wanted to diminish French political power. Macdonald wanted to protect it. But the deadlock got so unbelievably bad that in June 1864, they shockingly agreed to form this unlikely alliance called the Great Coalition, teaming up with George Etienne Cartier just to finally break the stalemate. So, how do you actually fix a mess like that? Well, their brilliant compromise all came down to choosing the right type of government structure. They weighed two options: a legislative union versus a federal union. A legislative union would basically cram all the power into one big, strong central government. But a federal union, that divides the power. It gives broader national powers to a central government while still allowing regional provinces the power to run their own local day-to-day affairs. They knew that if they ever wanted to get all these different groups on board, a federal union was the absolute only way forward. The really crucial point here is how this federal structure was viewed by different leaders. George Etienne Cartier, the political leader of Canada East, was highly optimistic about it. He genuinely believed a federal union would deliver greater protections and independence for French Canadians. Just look at this 1865 speech. He pictured this utopian unity where diversity, Catholic and Protestant, English, French, Irish, and Scotch, would all uniquely contribute to the prosperity and glory of a brand new confederacy. But as you can probably guess, not everyone shared Cartier's optimism. J.B.E. Dorion, an anti-Confederationist journalist and politician from Canada East, represented a very real fear of being totally swallowed up by a central authority. His argument was that whenever power was shared between local and general governments, the central government would always win out in a conflict, basically crushing the legitimate claims of the individual provinces. And that exact fear of centralization brings us right to Section 3, Atlantic colony resistance. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the sheer math of the situation. As we shift eastward, we find colonies with economies based heavily on timber, shipbuilding, and fishing. They already had really strong trade relationships with Britain and the US, so frankly, they were super skeptical about hitching their wagon to all the internal drama of the Canadas. And that skepticism makes total sense when you look at the numbers. In 1860 and 1861, Canada West had roughly 1.4 million people, and Canada East had 1.1 million. But all the Atlantic colonies combined? Barely 800,000. For the smaller Atlantic colonies, these numbers were absolutely terrifying. If they joined a union based on representation by population, their voices would literally be drowned out. Because of that huge imbalance, every single one of these colonies had a unique, highly valid reason to hit the brakes on Confederation. Prince Edward Island worried their tiny voice would just be ignored. Nova Scotia felt their economy was already booming without it. Newfoundland felt entirely isolated geographically. And New Brunswick harbored a deep fear of upper Canadian control. Let's zoom in on these for a second. For Prince Edward Island, their main industries tied them way closer to Britain and the US than to the Canadas. Their premier, Edward Palmer, nailed their hesitation perfectly in 1864. He essentially said they'd be handing over their rights and prosperity to a government where their voice would be, in his own words, very insignificant. Down in Nova Scotia, former Premier Joseph Howe actively fought the Union with a famous series of writings, brilliantly called the Botheration Letters. His argument was basically, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. He pointed out that Nova Scotia was already secure, with abundant fisheries, busy shipyards, and an overflowing treasury. To Howe, tossing all that into a new union seemed like a completely unnecessary risk. Newfoundland had a slightly different problem. In the 1860s, they were stuck in a severe economic slump because their vital cod and seal industries had taken a hit. But anti-Confederationists like Charles Fox Bennett argued this was just a temporary setback. He leaned into their sheer geographic isolation, arguing it made zero sense to give up control of their rich resources to some distant central government that could offer them practically nothing in return. And over in New Brunswick, this potent fear of being dominated by the center actually led to massive political upheaval. Anti-Confederation politician Albert J. Smith warned that in a few years we shall be at the feet of Canada, who will exercise control. That message hit so hard that Smith actually led his forces to victory in the 1865 general election, temporarily stopping the Union dead in its tracks, at least until intense pressure from Britain forced a reversal a year later. So the East was heavily divided. But what about the West? Let's move our explainer out to Section 4, expanding to the West. Out in Rupert's Land and the Pacific Coast, the stakes completely shifted. The fur trade was dying out, and the new driving force was this fierce fear of American expansionism, manifest destiny. Now, when it came to taking over this vast wilderness, our two great rivals from earlier had entirely different motivations. John A. Macdonald was acting out of pure defensive fear. He basically said he'd be fine leaving the country a wilderness for 50 years, but if Englishmen didn't move in, the Yankees will. George Brown, on the flip side, had aggressive imperial ambition. He saw it as Canada's chance to become the greatest, wealthiest colony on Earth. Meanwhile, you have to remember the people actually living in the West were facing an absolute perfect storm of crises. The fur trade was tanking, disappearing bison were causing terrible famine for First Nations communities, and out on the Pacific coast, the gold rush bust left a mountain of debt. In 1866, Britain literally forced Vancouver Island and British Columbia to unite just to try and fix their shattered economies. As the bills piled up, these isolated colonies were so desperate, they actually weighed joining a distant confederation against a very, very tempting alternative, just letting the United States annex them. Which brings us perfectly to our final section, alternatives to Confederation, because, trust me, there were other options. It is absolutely vital to remember that Confederation was not inevitable. It was just one idea on the table for these struggling colonies. One of the most serious alternatives was something called the Maritime Union. Proposed by leaders like Arthur Hamilton Gordon, this was a plan to unite only New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and Prince Edward Island, and the logic was really sound. They could pool their tax dollars to build massive infrastructure projects like railways, but completely avoid losing their regional power to the much larger province of Canada. And this brilliantly illustrates where all those competing ideas spectacularly collided, the September 1864 Charlottetown Conference, embodied here by two former premiers, both incredibly named John Hamilton Gray, one from PEI and one from New Brunswick, deep in conversation. What's wild is that this conference was originally organized specifically to discuss that independent maritime union. It was a massive historical crossroads where multiple paths for North America were passionately debated, right before the Canadians crashed the party to pitch their bigger Confederation idea. Which leaves us with a truly fascinating final thought. What if they had said no? What alternatives to Confederation might have resolved the problems in these individual colonies? Imagine if that maritime union had actually succeeded, or if the Pacific coast had chosen American annexation instead. How completely different would the map of North America look today if just one of those anti-Confederation voices had won out? It really puts into perspective just how fragile the birth of this country truly was. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. I hope it helped you understand the incredibly complex obstacle course that led to Confederation.